It is a great honour for us today to be able to welcome Professor Derek Attridge from the University of York to address us on what might seem a strange conglomeration of different topics that face us in the English studies today. There's nobody perhaps in the world who is better situated to address us on where these topics align with each other than Derek Attridge, who has in a very illustrious career set out his claims in many different fields within the discipline of English studies, with many influential studies, whether it be in the form and prosody of poetry, or in post-colonial studies, in the study of South African literature, in the study of modernism with his two monographs on James Joyce, in literary theory with his contributions bringing literary thoughts of Jacques Derrida into English, and also in his own work setting out parameters for different ways of approaching literary texts in the late 20th and 21st century, and in its engagements with other writers such as Wickham and J. Kasia from South Africa. Derek brings together much of what is best about the dynamism of our discipline, and I hope we'll be able to welcome him very heartily today on this strange conglomeration of topics: post-critique, the decolonization of the curriculum, and the state of English studies today. So please join me in a hearty round of applause for Derek Attridge.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Cameron. How is the speaker? What do you think? Is that okay? Closer? How's that at the back of the room? Okay? Good. I'm very, very happy to be here in Bangkok and in Thailand for my first visit. Coming to an end very soon, unfortunately, but been having a wonderful time, enjoying meeting many interesting people and seeing many fascinating sights. I'd like to thank in particular, I won't give surnames because I probably couldn't pronounce them, but Suchiga, Natanai, Pojina, Masud, Cameron, and anybody else who was involved in making this visit and this tour from Chiang Mai to Bangkok possible. Now, I was invited to talk about two current developments, quite recent developments in literary studies, so-called post-critique and the decolonization of the curriculum. As Cameron said, this is quite a conglomeration of topics. The difficulty is that these two recent developments appear to point in opposite directions. Post-critique is a recent development which offers a challenge to political readings of literature, whereas the demand for the decolonization of the curriculum is a demand to apply political concerns to reading. First is a critique in itself of critique as too political, and the second is an argument that literary studies is not or not political enough. So I'm going to deal with them separately and then ask if it's possible to see connections between them. If there's a way of thinking about literary studies that draws on both post-critique and on decolonization. I'll give you an outline quickly before I start of how I'm going to approach this. So, as you see, we start with post-critique, I want to look at some associated ideas. I want to outline the story that those who identify themselves with post-critique tell about the preceding history of literary criticism. And then I want to try to correct that with what I think is the actual story of literary criticism in recent decades. And then turning to the question of decolonizing the curriculum, I want to look at a specific example, a country in which I grew up and which played an unusually prominent part in the call for the decolonization of the curriculum, South Africa. Then ask what it might mean in the metropolitan centres, like the UK and North America, and then to analyse a little what demands are being made and how they might be met. Finally, this question of whether the two approaches are completely opposed or whether there's a way of drawing both of them. And finally, some brief comments on what this means for the state of English studies today. So post-critique, what is post-critique? Well, the term became widespread after the publication of one book. Look on the left there, Rita Felsky's The Limits of Critique. That was published in 2015. It was followed up 2 years later by a collection of essays edited by Felsky herself and Elizabeth Anker, Critique and Post-Critique. Now, post-critique, it's not a label I'm terribly happy with, but I'm going to go with it for the time being, brings together a number of associated ideas that predate it. And I just want to focus on three. One is the question of affect or feeling, the role of feelings in discussing literature. This goes back in many ways to an important contribution by Eve Sedgwick in the late 1990s. So I'll give you just an example of a book that I contributed to that was published in 2020 on affect and literature, a series of essays looking at how emotion can be brought into the discussion of literature. And then Felsky's own follow-up book called Hooked, 2020, in which she discusses, as the subtitle suggests, the way in which one can become emotionally attached to the literary work one is reading. So as I say, they go back to, in many ways, to this groundbreaking essay by Eve Sedgwick, first published in 1997 and reprinted in her own book, Touching Feeling, in 2003. Sedgwick argued very strongly for the role of affect in talking about literature and distinguished between what she called reparative reading and paranoid reading, drawing on psychoanalysis. So paranoid reading would be reading, and I will come back to this, where you are suspicious of what you read, where you read with a suspicious mind, looking for opponents, looking for people who, or positions that might be opposed to yours, whereas reparative reading aims to repair the world and repair your own psyche. It's a positive approach. So that's one element, I think, in post-critique. Second one would be surface reading. Surface reading really became a well-known phrase after this edition of the Journal Representations, in which Stephen Best and Sharon Marcus wrote an introduction calling for more attention to the surface of literary works. So they were reacting against the kind of criticism that they saw as dominant for the last 20, 30 years, whereby the critic tried to burrow as deeply as possible into the work and look for hidden meanings that the author themselves didn't even know, ideological distortions that the clever critic was able to dig out. They argued, no, the job of the critic is to look more at the surface, to look at how the literary work operates, look at its forms, its more explicit content, and so on. So this too fed into the post-critique. And finally, what became known as new formalism, which really became widely talked about after this essay by Marjorie Levinson in PMLA in 2007, where she surveyed a number of books and articles that had appeared in the previous few years in which the forms, the formal features of literature were being examined in a way that hadn't been done, at least this was the claim, for a while, with the emphasis being on ideology, on history, on content, on empirical readings. So I would say those are three of the main ideas that feed into post-critique, the idea of the importance of emotion and especially the feelings of the reader engaging with the literary work, attention to the surface rather than to seek for hidden meanings, and an attention to literary form as well as, not instead of, but as well as an attention to content. Felsky is also very indebted to the work of Bruno Latour, but I don't really want to go into that. That will take us into actor network theory and object-oriented ontology and her own suggestions to what might replace critique, which is another story. I don't particularly agree with the way she takes it. Nor do many of those who subscribe to post-critique necessarily follow that path. So Rita Felsky in 2015 was reflecting shifts away from impersonal reading, the idea which had been fairly prominent that you don't allow your subjectivity as an individual to enter your criticism, you try and read objectively. Shifts away from historical and ideological analysis, shifts away from delving into the work's depths, often to expose its limitations, its ideological shortcomings, and an emphasis on content. Those are all important ways of doing literary criticism, which were being challenged by Felsky in that book. And in particular, she rejected what she calls critique in the sense of what's often called symptomatic reading, or the hermeneutics of suspicion. Symptomatic reading because it treats the text as having symptoms, which you then, like a doctor, analyze, symptoms of ideological failings, symptoms that the writer probably wasn't even aware of. Or the hermeneutics of suspicion because, just as with Sedgwick's, I meant the opposition between reparative and paranoid reading. So paranoid reading would be like suspicious reading where you are suspicious of the text that you read. And the great masters of suspicion, as they were called, influential in this approach, would be Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. And Felsky then argued, just putting this generally, not going into the particular arguments she made in terms of actor network theory, she argued for a more affirmative criticism, a more positive approach to literary works, recognizing the importance of feeling, coming closer to the experience of the ordinary reader, and celebrating the literary work rather than trying to diagnose it. And the idea that's encapsulated in this approach of post-critique depends on a story about literary criticism. That literary studies have been dominated by what she calls critique for, I don't know how long, 20, 30 years maybe. One of the most important books in what one might think of as this era of ideological study. Oops, way. Frederick Jameson's The Political Unconscious from 1981. Jameson famously arguing from a Marxist perspective that one always has to historicize as a critic, and one has to look at the political implications of literary works even when these are unconscious. So you can see the ideas of delving deeply into a work, the idea of the political and ideological significance of the work, the idea of the importance of history and of empirical studies all come together in Jameson and were very influential. So during this period, there were numerous studies of the ways in which sexism, racism, class bias, homophobia, and so on are all encoded, often unconsciously, in literary works. So that's Felsky's story, that this kind of critique dominated literary studies, at least from Jameson in 1981 to the present of which he's writing in 2015. Now, I would say the actual story is a bit more complicated. Certainly, symptomatic reading was one very important element in literary studies in this period, but there are many, many others, all moving away from what dominated literary studies in Britain and America and the colonies, British colonies in the mid-20th century, new criticism in America, F.R. Lewis's work and the work of the Journal Scrutiny in Britain, moving away from that towards a number of other approaches, but not just critique. Historical studies, straightforward historical studies, flourished, empirical studies. More and more students, academics got interested in the archive. The archive of modern literature became a new field of study. The manuscripts of James Joyce or Virginia Woolf became, Marcel Proust became very, very much grist to the academic researchers' mill. Alongside more traditional historical accounts came new historicism, especially after Stephen Greenblatt's path-breaking book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, inspired by Foucault to approach history in a somewhat different way, and with some influence from critique, because very often it was a question of analysing power relations, but still a version of history. And then after the mid-1970s, the influence in Anglophone literary studies of French philosophy and theory became very, very important. The influence of structuralism and post-structuralism and the work of, I mentioned a number of figures, two of them, Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, but also Jacques Lacan, Félix Esteva, and others. For them, literature was central, not as something offering itself for critique, but as something, as a genre, as a way of writing, as a use of language, which was able to probe areas that philosophy, straightforward philosophy, wasn't able to do. So literature was central to these thinkers, but not in a way that Felsky argues critique was central. And many other approaches in this period. I'm not going to go through any more, but you can think of ways in which the canon was expanded, particularly looking at writers, women writers, writers of non-white origins. You can think of stylistic analysis, you can think of biography, you can think of editorial projects, many major editorial projects in this period. Genetic studies, as I mentioned, looking at manuscripts. The importance of Bakhtin and ideas of dialogism and heteroglossia. All sorts of things going on. So the post-critique story, the critique dominated, is something of a caricature of Felsky's arguments, I think, are valid up to a point, but only up to a point. And secondly, I would argue, and it's a related point really, that her claim to be offering something novel is an exaggerated one. There are many earlier arguments in favour of an affirmative approach to literature, many earlier examples of the acknowledgement of affect, and of course much attention to questions of form. Those continental writers that I mentioned would be one example of an affirmative approach, an approach which saw literature as valuable rather than literature as something that had to be diagnosed for its sins. Those names like Bach, Lacan, Derrida, Deleuze, Christeva, Patu, Agamben, a number of continental writers who were doing not the same thing as Spelsky, but certainly something related. There were also phenomenological approaches which focus very much on the reader, on the ordinary reader, not the academic reader. Wolfgang Iser in the 1970s was an important figure in analysing the way readers respond to literary works, particularly to the gaps and fissures in the literary work that the reader is invited to fill. So I feel I ought to make my own position clear vis-à-vis this variety of literary approaches and vis-à-vis the story told by the proponents of post-critique. My own attempt to spell out what I saw and still see as the appropriate way to think about literary works and literary reading, I spelled it out first in this book in 2004, which I followed up in 2015, same year as Spelsky's book, by another elaboration of some of these arguments called The Work of Literature. In the singularity of literature, I attempted to explain what it is about a literary work, about literary use of language, that can cause a reader or listener to be profoundly moved. What are the things, what are the features of the literary text, the specific, definitive features of the literary text that make it possible for a reader to feel something profound is happening when they read. In other words, I wasn't studying all literary reading, but I was assuming that readers of all kinds, not necessarily academic readers at all, but readers of all kinds who enjoy reading from time to time find themselves moved by the literary work, hence the importance of feeling, of course. And one part of my argument was against what I called instrumental reading, which is to say, reading a literary work for a specific and pre-decided purpose. Coming to literary work thinking, I'm going to look for X, Y, or Z. I'm going to see how this work upholds democracy or is ideologically unsound or gives me moral truths that I can live by, in a host of other ways in which you can approach a work already with an agenda. So you see it's related to critique, because critique, in Spelsky's sense, would be one way of approaching work with an agenda. Critique would be, I'm going to read this work, and I'm going to be suspicious, I'm going to delve beneath the surface to see what its hidden failings are, how it exposes, if I analyze it deeply enough, how it exposes the ideological sins of its writer and of its time. I was arguing instead for openness to the work, a willingness to be surprised and changed by the work. So the key terms in my account, there were three key terms: inventiveness, the feeling when you read the work that it is doing something inventive, something innovative, something new. Otherness, the feeling that you're being taken out of the familiar world into something else, to some other zone, something you hadn't experienced before. And singularity, which is like the one I put in the title, the distinctiveness of the work that you're reading, what makes it different from every other work in existence. And I also argue that it's essential to the power of the work to move and change the reader through its inventiveness, its otherness, and its singularity, is its form. That this is how literature works, this is how the artwork operates, as opposed to other things that might, other ways of using language that might indeed be powerful and moving, like an historical account or a journalistic account of atrocities. Other ways of writing, what's specific about literature, and this could actually be a historical account but written in a literary way, is the form, is the use of syntax, of narrative, of rhythm, of sound, metaphor, diction, all those things, all those tools that the literary writer has at their disposal in order to produce something moving and powerful. Moreover, the way form works in literature, I argue, is through an appreciation of the work, an experience of the work, not as an object, but as an event. That the, if you like, the ontological status of the literary work is that of an event, something that happens, and it happens in the reading. The object is simply words on the page, sounds in the air, and that's very neutral. When those get converted into a certain kind of experience, you can say literature has happened. So you can see this approach is a sort of post-critique, anticipating many of the arguments of post-critique, though with a more specific, positive account of how literature works. Whereas Felsky's, at least the 2015 book, is largely, as I said earlier, a critique of critique. It's largely negative. Right, let's turn now to the question of decolonizing the curriculum. And here I'm going to bring in my own background because I know it, but also because South Africa, where I grew up, was particularly important in the recent events leading to the call for decolonization of the curriculum. I was at school and university in South Africa in the 1950s and early 1960s when the English curriculum, both school and university, was entirely British and American. I studied Shakespeare, Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, William Wordsworth, John Milton, and so on. I also, like every white child in South Africa in the 1950s, studied the Afrikaans language, because there were then two official languages in the country, English and Afrikaans. And in studying Afrikaans, which I talked a bit about in Chiang Mai the other day, in studying Afrikaans, of course I studied South African authors, because there were only South African authors writing in Afrikaans. But in my English lessons, they were all mostly English, a few Scottish or Irish or American. And when I moved to Cambridge in the late 1960s, I did experience an expansion of the works I was studying. I was introduced to more works from outside of the UK and America, works of ancient Greek tragedy or French classical tragedy or the Russian novel or the Norwegian theatre, but didn't go beyond that. I wasn't exposed to anything outside the European centre, what was thought of then as the centre. I did encounter occasionally something called Commonwealth Studies. Commonwealth Studies was the study of the literature in English in the British Commonwealth, which is to say the successor to the British Empire. Those countries that once were colonies had then become associates, as it were, associate members of the British Commonwealth. But this field of Commonwealth studies was very small and very much a sideline, an add-on, if you like. Now, I was aware when I I stayed in Britain to continue to my academic career, I was aware that things were changing back in South Africa, that students and maybe younger faculty were saying, well, why do we live and work in South Africa and we spend our academic hours studying literature from Britain and America? What about South African writers? What about other African writers? And the curriculum changed. Broadened to include South African and African writers, usually in English. And then in 1994, democracy came at last to South Africa. There was a democratic election. Nelson Mandela was elected president. The African National Congress came into power, and that old system of two white languages, two European languages, English and Afrikaans being the only official languages, ended, and the new policy was that there were 11 official languages, including the two most widely spoken languages, isiZulu and isiXhosa. And if I was at school after 1994, I would have been able to study one of those languages, one of the indigenous languages, rather than Afrikaans. And of course, what changed dramatically was the admission of black students to schools and universities, which under the apartheid era hadn't happened. So this is an example of how the curriculum in South African universities was decolonized, in the sense that the domination by literature, by the literary planners, makers of curricula, the domination of the colonial centre, Great Britain, was ended, partly as a result of student protest and younger academics, as I said. And I know there was a similar process in certainly Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, process whereby first of all local white writers, the descendants of the colonial masters, began to be read, as well as the writing in the colonial centre, and then more recently indigenous writers in the indigenous languages, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. And perhaps a similar process, I don't know, in Brazil for Portuguese, and Argentina for Spanish, Indonesia for Dutch, Martinique for French, but I don't know. It seems to be quite possible that there was a similar trajectory. So that's the colonial countries. Clearly in those countries there was a kind of long-standing decolonization process. But what about the curriculum in the UK and the USA? Well, here we talk about post-colonialism. If we go back to, say, 1978, when Edward Said published his influential book, Orientalism, a growing awareness of the importance of colonial cultures and the post-colonial literary productions. So Commonwealth Studies, this minor addition to literary studies in English, morphed into post-colonial studies. Post-colonial studies focusing very directly on the literary productions both before and after the end of the colonial period, in usually in English again. There's still a domination here by the English language in English departments, which I suppose makes some sense, but it does have its negative side. But post-colonial studies still remain largely an add-on. Universities started to offer courses on post-colonial literature, which students could take if they were interested, or one or two post-colonial works were included in a survey of British literature, and it became evident to many people, again many students, that something more radical was needed, that a change in mindset, if you like, had to happen, that it wasn't enough just to add some works from the colonial countries, or the post-colonial countries as they were then. go back to actually a much earlier work, Ngugi Wa Thiong'o's work, the decolonization of the mind had to happen, a new mindset. Now, where did this impetus come from? Well, this is where we go back to South Africa. And the University of Cape Town, which is a very, very beautiful university under the flank of Table Mountain, in land that was bequeathed for the purposes of the university by Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was the archetypal colonist, imperialist, and when he died, he gave this beautiful tract of land to the university. As a result, the center of Cape Town University had a statue of Cecil Rhodes, and this statue became the focus of student protests. You may have heard of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. So, although it was a much wider protest about the colonization or the remnants of colonization in the university, it became focused on this one particular statue. There were protests around it. It was defaced, excrement poured over it, and eventually the university authorities decided to remove it. There's one dramatic picture of the statue being removed and the students celebrating the moment by giving poor old Cecil what he deserved. And this moment and these pictures spread around the world. Interestingly, this was in 2015. This is the same year that Rita Felsky's Elements of Critique came out. It was echoed around the world. Rhodes Must Fall became a hashtag and a meme echoed in universities right around the world. There was a related event in Oriel College, Oxford, which also was dependent on it for its flourishing on money given to it by Cecil Rhodes, and which has a statue of Cecil Rhodes right in the front of the college overlooking the High Street. In this case, the statue wasn't removed. The fellows of the college decided to ignore calls for that particular Rhodes to fall. It's still there. So this movement was a movement really which underlying these demands about a particular statue, and there were similar demands around the world for similar statues. There was a notorious famous event in Bristol in England where a well-known colonial figure memorialized in a statue the statue was pulled down into the harbour. It was also related to gathered strength from the continuing Black Lives Matter movement, which you remember was began after the murder by the police of Trayvon Martin in 2013. So those feelings about police brutality and police racism were still very strong. These all came together in the demands for decolonization. So what were these demands? Well, the demands that the ongoing effects, colonialism and indeed slavery, be acknowledged, including the remaining racism still prevalent in white societies, that the complicity of British and American writers in colonialism being exposed, which is a version of a critique, of course, and that the contribution of black and other immigrant populations to literature in the metropolitan centres be celebrated, and in the former colonies, indigenous peoples' work be celebrated. But above all, a change, as I say, a change in mindset, an understanding that for a very long time, a certain approach to literature, to culture, to history had been dominant, and this was that of the white, often English-speaking part of the population. So many universities, in response to these demands, put in place procedures to attempt to meet to meet them, or at least theory to meet them. And I'll just give you the opening statement of Keele University's Manifesto for Decolonizing the Curriculum. Decolonization involves identifying colonial systems, structures and relationships and working to challenge those systems. It is not integration or simply the token inclusion of the intellectual achievements of non-white cultures. Rather, it involves a paradigm shift from a culture of exclusion and denial to the making of space for other political philosophies and knowledge systems. It's a culture shift to think more widely about why common knowledge is what it is, and in so doing, adjusting cultural perceptions and power relations in real and significant ways. So the claim there is that what we think of too easily as common knowledge is in fact white privileged knowledge, and that there are other forms of knowledge which need to be given as prominent a place. And one university English department that has made changes to many of its courses is the University of Nottingham. And I'll give you their account of changes made to the course on Shakespeare. We have considered how our teaching of Shakespeare can move beyond the his identification as the archetypal dead white male author, and considered the fact that his works have always been appropriated to speak for disenfranchised groups as well as those in power. This module decenters the author and instead privileges the diverse range of practitioners and interpreters who have reperformed Shakespeare to speak to different moments and communities. We work on productions directed by and cast with diverse practitioners across race, gender, disability and language, and our secondary reading draws on a wide range of critical approaches, including critical race studies, queer, trans theory, feminism, and global Shakespeare studies, to support students in continuing the work of decolonizing Shakespeare. Now, clearly, post-critique and decolonization are in many ways opposed. To decolonize the curriculum can mean, at least in part, to show how the works of white authors embody racist or colonial attitudes, and this clearly is a form of critique, as defined by Rita Felsky. So my question is it possible to undertake decolonization in the spirit of post-critique, that's to say, a spirit of affirmation, affirming positively literary works, focusing on what I call their inventiveness, otherness and alterity, and exploring effective responses to these works? Well, this Nottingham description gives one possible answer, because instead of showing the implicit racism in Shakespeare's works, which in a sense is a dead end because you're exposing the racism implicit in late 16th, early 17th century England, and instead of doing that, they want to celebrate the variety of interpretations of Shakespeare, including many that oppose racism. So they, as I said, they shift away from the author as the central figure and look at the way that that author's works can be and have been put to various uses. And of course, the other way in which affirmation comes into the decolonized curriculum is the inclusion of other voices to be affirmed and celebrated. So finally, what do English studies in Anglophone countries look like today? I would say the most striking feature is the huge variety of approaches. Many areas are being explored in relation to current issues of political and ethical significance in the wider world, like environmental studies, disability studies, transgender studies, queer studies, studies of race, decolonization, if you like, finding its place not just in race and the ongoing effects of slavery, but in these other areas as well. We're also seeing the growth of world literature, to some extent displacing post-colonial studies. Often works in English being studied in translation, and I talked a bit of Chiang Mai about some of the problems of using translation in world literature. Some revived interest in form. Poetry is having quite a good moment at present. Lyric studies, growth of digital humanities, of course, making use of AI and other developments in IT technology. Some of this would come under the umbrella of post-critique, or the umbrella of decolonizing the curriculum, but quite a lot of it wouldn't. And many scholars continue, of course, doing the traditional historical and bibliographical, biographical, textual work. It's also the case that the teaching of creative writing has had an explosion in Britain in the last 10 years. It's already a big thing in America. Another important aspect, I think, of English studies or the study of humanities more generally in Britain today is how much it's under attack from, above all, the ideology of neoliberalism, the constant appeal to the market, to profitability, measuring what universities do purely by the financial outcome, by what students are able to earn once they get their degrees. And to those in the administration of education who think like this, neither post-critique nor the decolonization of the curriculum are of any interest in particular. Whatever earns money is okay. Numbers are falling, applications for English, applications for the humanities are falling, both in schools and in universities, as the government and others put pressure on parents and on students to follow what they see as more vocational courses. And in some places, literary departments are trying to make their courses more vocational, though that can be rather difficult. Perhaps the answer is to provide evidence that English graduates are actually employable and do pretty well in employment. The British Academy has just published a report on the state of English studies today, in which they give evidence of the employability of English graduates. But I don't think we should capitulate to these pressures to think only in terms of employability and financial gain. I think we should continue to value literature and literary criticism as contributions to a world that's more open to otherness, that celebrates difference, and that seeks to broaden aesthetic enjoyment. And I think both post-critique and decolonization play into that agenda, along with other approaches. I think they can all be put together and to be seen as contributing to the goal of taking literature as an important part of our lives, one which gives us both pleasure and changes us into fuller, richer, hopefully more generous human beings. Thank you.
เนื่องจากรับหน้าที่มาสรุปทุกอย่างเป็นภาษาไทยนะคะขอเวลา5 วิในการประมวลผลนะคะใครเปิดเสียงจิ้งหรีดเดี๋ยวนะก็คิดว่าหลายๆท่านก็คงทราบตามประเด็นต่างๆได้นะคะแต่ทีนี้ก็เผื่อก็จะมาช่วยกันแรปอัพประเด็นนิดนึงนะคะแล้วก็เผื่อใครมีอะไรที่อยากจะถามหรือสงสัยเนี่ยจะได้มีเวลาไดเจสต์นิดนึงนะคะถ้าเกิดว่าใครอยากจะเสริมเติมประเด็นอะไรก็แจ้งได้เลยนะคะเสริมมาได้เลยเนาะนะคะโอเคอย่างที่โมเดเลเตอร์ของเรานะคะได้บอกแต่ตั้งแต่แรกคือเราแอสไซน์หัวข้อให้ Prof.Derek เนี่ยค่อน ข้างจะ challenging มากซับซ้อนหลายหัวข้อมากนะคะแล้วเราก็ขออาจารย์ว่าทำไงดีเราสนใจเรื่อง post critique แล้วเราก็สนใจเรื่อง decolonizing curriculum ด้วยทำยังไงที่อาจารย์จะเอามันมาเชื่อมโยงกันได้นะคะแล้วเราก็เห็นว่าสิ่งที่อาจารย์นำเสนอเนี่ยมีประเด็นน่าสนใจมากหลายอย่างนะคะประเด็นแรกนะคะก็คือเรื่อง post critique หรือ post critical movement อะไรอย่างนี้แล้วกันนะคะอาจารย์ก็เริ่มต้นด้วยการอธิบายบริบทของการเกิดของกระแส post critique นะคะซึ่งจริงๆแล้วมันเป็นกระแสที่ตอบโต้กับเหมือนกับคล้ายๆ framework ของ literary study ที่มัน dominant อยู่นะอย่างน้อยที่สุดในโลกตะวันตกมันก็คือcritical theory หรือสิ่งที่เราเรียกว่าทฤษฎีวิพากษ์ทั้งหลายนะคะซึ่งในบริบทนี้ก็ใช้คำว่า critique นะคะซึ่งสาย critique เนี่ยเราก็อาจจะทราบกันดีถ้าเรียนวรรณกรรมก็คือมีสมมติฐานอยู่ว่าการอ่านเชิงวิพากษ์เนี่ยมันจะต้องเป็นการขุดลึกลงไปให้มันแบบลึกสุดนะคะของภายใต้ตัวบทเนี่ยนะคะเพื่อที่จะหาชุดอุดมการณ์ที่อยู่เบื้องหลังตัวบทนะคะแล้วก็เปิดโปงมันอะไรต่ออะไรดี mystify นู่นนี่นั่นใช่ไหมคะซึ่งนักคิดสำคัญ3คนที่มีอิทธิพลมากในกระแสนี้เนี่ยก็คือคนแรกคาร์ล มาร์กซ์คนที่2ซิกมันด์ ฟรอยด์แล้วคนที่3คืออะไรมีใครจำได้ไหมนิเช่นะคะซึ่งเราทราบกันอยู่แล้วเวลาที่เราวิเคราะห์แบบ post แบบ critical เนี่ยนะคะเราก็มีความเชื่ออยู่ว่ามันต้องมีอะไรอยู่เบื้องหลังข้างใต้ที่มัน unconscious มันอะไรต่ออะไรนั่นก็คืออิทธิพลของฟรอยด์เนาะแล้วก็การหาความบกพร่องทางดวงตาเนี่ยก็คือแนวคิดของมาร์กซ์แหละใช่ไหมคะแล้วก็ในภายหลังเนี่ยเราอาจจะได้ยินคนที่วิจารณ์แนวทางเนี่ยเรียกมันในหลายแบบไม่ว่าจากเมื่อกี้ที่อาจารย์เดเรกพูดนะคะ hermeneutic of suspicious นะคะเป็นแบบการอ่านแบบสงสัยระแวงนะคะ paranoid reading หรือว่า symptomatic reading อ่านหาอาการอ่านหาภาวะความป่วยไข้ของตัวบทนะคะตัวอย่างงานที่ดังมากชิ้นหนึ่งที่อาจารย์ยกขึ้นมาก็คือซึ่ง merge เอาแนวคิดของมาร์กซ์กับฟรอยด์ไว้ด้วยกันก็คือ political unconscious ของเฟรดริก เจฟเฟอร์สันซึ่งก็ออกมานานแล้วนะตั้งแต่ปี1981นะคะยุค80นะคะทีนี้ดังนั้นถามว่าสาย post critical ทำอะไรนะคะพวก post critique เนี่ยก็พยายามเสนอการอ่านแบบอื่นที่ shift away จาก ideological analysis การวิเคราะห์อุดมการณ์เนี่ยไปสู่สิ่งที่อาจจะเรียกว่ามีหลายชื่อนะอาจจะเป็นการอ่านแบบคือแทนที่จะอ่านขุดลึกใช่ไหมก็อ่านแบบพื้นผิวก็คือ surface reading หรืออ่านแบบแทนที่จะหาอาการป่วยก็อ่านแบบรักษานะคะเป็น reparative reading นะคะหรือว่ามีนักทฤษฎีคนหนึ่งที่เดเรกยกขึ้นมาพูดถึงนะคะซึ่งอาจารย์บอกว่าอาจารย์อาจจะไม่ได้ไปในทางนี้เท่าไหร่นะคะคือริต้า เฟลสกี้นะคะเว้นก็เป็นคนหนึ่งที่เสนอแนวคิดแบบ post critical แล้วก็ได้รับอิทธิพลโดยตรงมาจากบรูโน่ ลาทัวร์นะคะซึ่งก็จะเป็นสายอะไรนะ assemblage อะไรกันไปนะคะซึ่งในบทนี้เราไม่ได้พูดถึงอันนี้นะคะมีส่วนที่แชร์กันแล้วก็มีส่วนที่ต่างกันซึ่งก็post critique เนี่ยก็จะคล้ายๆกับทฤษฎีอื่นๆก็คือว่ามันเป็นชั้งของแนวคิดที่มันก็จะมีหลายๆสายนะคะแต่ละคนก็ไม่ได้คิดเหมือนกันไปทั้งหมดนะคะงานของอาจารย์ที่มีอาจารย์เดเรกที่มีอิทธิพลสำคัญชิ้นหนึ่งก็คือ singularity of literature นะคะซึ่งอาจารย์บอกว่าอยากจะนำเสนอเนี่ยนะคะ willingness to be surprised and changed by the work หมายถึงว่าอยากเปิดโอกาสให้คนยังไงสามารถที่จะถูกเซอร์ไพรส์แล้วก็ถูกเปลี่ยนแปลงโดยตัวงานได้แทนที่จะเป็นลักษณะของการอ่านแบบ instrumental ก็คืออ่านเพื่อแบบหาธงอะไรบางอย่างมาตอบโจทย์อะไรบางอย่างอะไรอย่างเงี้ยนะคะแล้วอาจารย์ก็บอกว่าคีย์เวิร์ดของงานของอาจารย์มี3อันหนึ่งก็คือ inventiveness นะคะอ่านแล้วเรา invent อะไรได้บ้างจากตรงนั้นนะคะแทนที่จะไปขุดรื้อคือภาษาสายคริติคนี่ก็คือฉันจะทำลายอะไรต่ออะไรทุกอย่างใช่ไหมถอนรากนู่นนี่เปิดโปงอะไรเงี้ยแต่อันนี้เป็นลักษณะของการ invent นะคะ2ก็คือ otherness นะคะเราสามารถจากการอ่านเนี่ยเราสามารถจะเทคตัวเองเนี่ยออกจากโลกที่เราคุ้นเคยได้แค่ไหนยังไงนะคะส่วนประการที่3ที่เป็นชื่อหนังสือก็คือ singularity นะคะเราหา distinctiveness จุดเด่นจุดลักษณะเฉพาะ ของงานที่ตัวเองอ่านนะคะซึ่งอาจารย์บอกว่าจริงแล้วการที่จะทำอย่างนั้นได้เนี่ยมันอาจจะต้องเป็นในที่ตัว form นะคะแทนที่จะเป็นที่ตัว language เพราะ language มันก็เป็น language ทั้งนั้นแหละนะคะแล้วคิดว่าเดาว่ามันน่าจะเป็นการปลดล็อกไอ้ linguistic term ด้วยนะคะเพราะถ้าการหันไปหา form เนี่ยมันก็จะเป็นส่วนที่ทำให้งานมันมีลักษณะเฉพาะน้ำหนักพิเศษขึ้นมานะคะโอเคอันนี้เป็นก้อนแรกก็คือก้อน post critical นะคะส่วนก้อนที่2นะคะก็เป็นเรื่องของ decolonization of the curriculum นะคะการถอดรากอาณานิคมของหลักสูตรนะโดยเฉพาะอย่างยิ่งหลักสูตรการศึกษาวรรณกรรมอังกฤษนะคะซึ่งอาจารย์พูดถึงบริบทของเซาท์แอฟริกาซึ่งก็จะคล้ายๆกับเมืองไทยว่าเราถ้าเกิดว่าใครสอนในอังกฤษเนี่ยก็เด็กต้องมีคำถามมาว่าแบบว่าเราเรียนทำไมแล้วมันคือเกี่ยวอะไรกับประเทศเราใช่ไหมแล้วทำไมเราไม่อ่านงานที่มันเป็นแบบว่าindigenous language หรืออะไรก็ตามแต่นะคะซึ่งโอเคแน่นอนในโลกตะวันตกและประเทศที่เคยเป็นอดีตอาณานิคมเนี่ยจะรู้สึกถึงสิ่งนี้มากกว่าเรานะคะรู้สึกว่าโดนกดขี่อะไรต่างๆใช่ป่ะไม่ได้เรียนภาษาของตัวเองต้องบอกไว้ก่อนในบทของประเทศอดีตอาณานิคมเนี่ยไม่มี national literature นะคะคือมันจะไม่เหมือนเมืองไทยโอเคเมืองไทยก็มีวรรณกรรมไทยอะไรเงี้ยแต่ประเทศอดีตอาณานิคมเนี่ยมันไม่มี national literature แต่แรกไม่มี department ของการเรียนวรรณกรรมของชาติของเขาดังนั้นเขาก็จะรู้สึกสิ่งนี้มากกว่าในประเทศไทยเนาะอาจารย์ก็บอกว่าไอ้ domination ของวรรณกรรมของเจ้าอาณานิคมเนี่ยมันมีกระแสของการล้มการตั้งคำถามกันอะไรเงี้ยอยู่มานานแล้วเหมือนกันนะคะแล้วก็เพราะว่าอย่างที่บอกส่วนใหญ่มันก็จะเป็นประเทศที่เคยเป็นอดีตอาณานิคมเนาะแล้วส่วนใน UK แล้วก็ US เองเนี่ยก็เริ่มมีเมื่อไม่นานมานี้แต่ก็เป็น10 ปีแล้วนะคะก็มีการวิพากษ์ไอ้ colonial culture แล้วก็ post colonial literary production ทั้งหลายเนี่ยนะคะมาหลาย10 ปีแล้วนะคะแล้วงานที่มีอิทธิพลมากๆที่ทุกคนรู้จักอันนี้ก็คืองาน Orientalism ของ Edward Said ซึ่งออกมาเมื่อปี 1978 นะคะแล้วก็เมื่อเร็วๆนี้เนี่ยเราจะเห็น movement ของการเรียกร้องให้ decolonize เนี่ยทั่วโลกเลยไม่ใช่เฉพาะที่เซ็นเตอร์หมายถึงอังกฤษอเมริกานะคะแต่เป็นประเทศอื่นๆที่เป็นอดีตอาณานิคมด้วยนะคะแล้วก็มีทั้งในแล้วก็นอกห้องเรียนอาจารย์ก็ยกตัวอย่างของเซาท์แอฟริกานะคะซึ่งก็ดังมากก็คือการmovement อะไรนะ Rose Must Fall นะปี 2015 นะคะซึ่งถ้าใครไม่ทราบนะคะเซอร์ซิลโรสนี่ก็คือเป็นอดีตนายกของเคปโคโลนีนะคะประมาณช่วงปลายศตวรรษที่19เข้า20นะคะนั้นไอ้ movement อันเนี้ยมันก็ไม่ได้เกิดเดี่ยวๆมันเกิดร่วมกับmovement ที่ต่อต้าน racism อย่างเช่นBlack Lives Matter อะไรต่างๆด้วยก็คือมันเป็น movement ที่ไม่ได้เกิดอยู่ในคอนเทกซ์ที่มันเฉพาะในโลกอะคาเดมีค่ะมันเกิดขึ้นทั่วโลกเนาะแล้วก็ในห้องเรียนก็มีนะคะคือตัวสาขาสถาบันคนทำคริคูลัมเองเนี่ยอย่างที่จะยกขึ้นมาก็คือน่าจะเป็นที่ Nottingham เนาะกับ Kew University เขาก็พยายามที่จะ question ไอ้คริคูลัมของตัวเองนะคะแล้วไอ้ตรงจุดเนี้ยที่เราคิดว่ามันมีการ merge กันของข้อเสนอของอาจารย์ในช่วงแรกก็คือ post critical theory กับไอ้ตัว decolonization นะคะอาจารย์ยกตัวอย่างการเรียนเชคสเปียร์นะคะถ้าเกิดว่าสมัยก่อนคนเรียนเชคสเปียร์คือเรียนไอ้แบบออริจินอลใช่ไหมคะเป็นชีวิตคนขาวสังคมคนขาวประวัติศาสตร์คนขาวอะไรต่ออะไรแล้วก็เรียนเพื่อจะ appreciate culture ของคนอังกฤษใช่ไหมคะแต่ว่าถ้าเรายกตัวอย่างง่ายๆว่าถ้าเป็นสาย critical เนี่ยนะเป็นสายวิพากษ์เนี่ยก็จะต้องไปดูแลไอเชคสเปียร์มันชั่วร้ายยังไงในฐานะคนขาวใช่ไหมเราต้องไปเปิดโปงอุดมการณ์เหมือนเขาเรียกอะไรเจ้าอนาถของเจ้าอาณานิคมหรือแนวคิดชายเป็นใหญ่หรืออะไรก็ตามแต่อะไรเงี้ยมันก็จะไปทางเส้นนั้นนะคะแต่ว่าถ้าเกิดว่าจะไม่ทำแบบนั้นล่ะถ้าจะไม่ทำแบบคริติคจะทำยังไงนะคะอาจารย์ก็เสนอว่าเราก็อาจจะไปดูได้ไหมว่าตัวบทเนี้ยมันถูกใช้โดยใครบ้างใช้ยังไงบ้างไม่ว่าจะโดยกลุ่มที่ privilege หรือ under privilege ก็ตามนะคะแล้วดูว่างานมันถูกเอามามองในแง่มุมต่างๆที่ไม่ได้เกี่ยวกับตัว origin มันได้อย่างไรบ้างนะคะซึ่งอันนี้อาจจะพอได้บอกว่ามันอาจจะพาเราปลดล็อกการที่เราจะถามกันว่า งั้นเลิกอ่านเลยแม้งานคนขาวหรือว่างานผู้ชายหรือว่าเราต้องเซ็นเซอร์มันไหมอะไรอย่างเงี้ยไอ้กรณีเนี้ยมันก็จะเป็นอีกทางหนึ่งนะคะแล้วก็โอเคแล้วเราก็อาจจะไปโฟกัสที่ความเป็นไปได้ที่หลากหลายของการตีความแล้วก็การนำไปใช้ก็คือมองผ่านการมองข้ามไม่ใช่ค่ะผ่านการวิพากษ์ไปสู่การ invent เมื่อกี้ที่อาจารย์บอก inventiveness นะคะในinvent อะไรใหม่ๆในการตีความแล้วก็แทนที่จะมองมันเป็นตัวบทหรือ object ที่เป็นผลผลิตของยุคสมัยของมันก็มองมันเป็น event นะคะการมองเป็น event ก็คือเราเห็นมันในคอนเทกซ์ที่มันกว้างกว่าตัวบทชิ้นเดียวแล้วก็ลองเหมือนคล้ายๆใช้ creativity ของตัวเองในการเอามันไปใส่ตรงไหนยังไงเล่นกับมันยังไงได้บ้างต่อยอดมันยังไงใช้ใส่คอนเทกซ์ใหม่ๆให้มันอะไรประมาณนี้นะคะแล้วก็โอเคอันนี้ก็เป็นการ merge ของ2ไอเดียที่อาจารย์ได้พูดไว้ตอนแรกนะคะแล้วก็สุดท้ายอาจารย์สรุปว่าไอ้ English study เนี่ยถ้าพูดถึง employability เนี่ยมันก็ยังมีอยู่นะคะคนไม่ต้องห่วงแต่ว่าอยากแต่อาจารย์เสนอว่าประเด็นเรื่อง employability มันก็อาจจะไม่ใช่โกขนาดนั้นแล้วเราอาจจะต้องพยายามคิดถึงวิธีการที่เราจะสามารถร่วม contribute to the goal of taking literature as จดไม่ผิดนะคะแต่ว่าจำไม่ได้ว่า as อะไรแต่เอาเป็นว่าคือว่าในฐานะสิ่งที่มันอาจจะให้ pleasure กับเราแล้วก็ทำให้เรากลายเป็นคนที่ fully richer แล้วก็ more generous person ประมาณนี้นะคะก็อันนี้สรุปเนาะถ้าอยากจะเสริมอะไรก็ได้เลยนะคะแล้วตอนนี้ขอเชิญแคมรอนให้อาจารย์ขึ้นทุกคนนะคะเดี๋ยวแคม
Very much. So Nakwa, a very rapid and thorough summary. So Derek has graciously opened himself up for any questions that we might have. Do we have anyone who wanted to start us off? So we've got Judith. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to oversimplify like crazy for a moment, but when I was first studying Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, critical theory that was dominant was the new criticism. So I was encouraged to attend to the marvelous pattern of symbols that were woven into the text. By the time I came to be teaching the Heart of Darkness, and post-colonial studies were very influential, I was encouraged to attend to how many racist and imperialist assumptions were woven into the text. If I were teaching under the aegis of post-critique, what would I be encouraged to see?
Okay, yes. You'd be encouraged probably to do something more like your first version, but I would hope, if I were in charge of that course which you were studying, I would want you to read Chinua Achebe's attack on Conrad and to understand, just as the Nottingham English Department approaches Shakespeare, to understand that the richness of the work can be measured by the variety of responses. It doesn't really answer your question because I can't put myself into Rita Belsky's head and she might say something different. But that's the way I would hope you'd be able to integrate attention to the language, to the symbolic devices, the formal properties of Conrad's writing, with an awareness of the fact that not just Conrad, but many, not just writers of his time, but people of his time, would not have picked up on the degree to which it's racist. And of course it's a savage attack on Belgian colonialism, which was something we would want to affirm and highlight. But it's a good question because it raises, I think, some of the problems of simple post-critique, as though we were simply going to go back to an earlier period and ignore what's happened since then, which I don't think is appropriate.
Thank you. We've got a second question. We've got a second question in the back. Yes.
เมื่อกี้อาจารย์สุธิดาแปลจากภาษาอังกฤษเป็นภาษาไทยเป็นขอช่วยอาจารย์สุธิดาช่วยแปลจากภาษาไทยเป็นภาษาอังกฤษ
ผมฟังแล้ว
คือต่างจากที่บรรยายเนี่ยมันเหมือนกับถ้าผมเข้าใจผิดขอโทษนะครับแต่ว่าฟังเหมือนกับว่าเราจะกลับไปที่ Davis Cambridge School of Literature หรือเปล่าคือหมายว่าผ่านจาก post critique แล้วจะกลับไปแบบ Davis School หรือเปล่าหรือว่าความแตกต่างเป็นยังไง
รู้เรื่องไหมคะแกม I think he wonders about how the older formalism kind of theory is different from this post-critical one. Can you expand on that?
Yes, in a way that's a similar question. I think I would say that old forms of formalism simply ignored the racial or sexual or gender implications of the writing and ignored the positionality of the critic who claimed to be simply an objective voice, ignoring the specific situation of the critic and ignoring the feelings involved in engaging with the work. The newer forms of formalism, at least the ones that I would want to put my weight behind, bring back into the center of attention the formal properties of literary work, but not losing sight of the way in which those formal properties play into both the feelings and also the ethical and political dimensions of the reader's grasp on the world. So form becomes not an end in itself, but part of a much richer playing out of the diverse possibilities of literary text as something that can enter people's lives and change people's grasp on the world. I think that again I'm not speaking for Rita Felsky and the proponents of post-critique because I don't really accept their arguments in full. But that's how I would want to see a return to formalism that's not the old formalism, but that has a new complexity, a new understanding of the way literature works and the way criticism should work.
Hi, Derek. Thank you for your generous approach to literature. So I'm going to speak from a perspective of a reader. So I have a few anecdotes to share. Probably we can discuss from that. First event, just in April, there was a discussion at London Book Fair about the titles of the seminar is 6% and then what? So 6% is the number of translated literature in UK. So for me, it's shockingly very small, and half of that 6% is from main European language. So I'm wondering what you think, the relationship between translations of English studies in outside Anglophone countries. This is one thing, because we often say that there's not so much literature to read in English, but there are so many barriers. In order to be readable, in this entire system, and it's also, interests publishing industries and politics of knowledge as a whole. And also the second anecdote, I just found a poem written by Bulgakov. So as you might know that, his book Lollitas had been, cut off, by regulations. But from my standpoint, I don't think no book should be banned or should be burned. So we can read from a Frasian perspective, from any perspective. That's why I really appreciate your generosity to the literature. So that poem called Lilith. So I'm not sure if you have come across that one. It's a portrayal of young girl. So some people believe that it's an origins genesis of the Lolita. And for me, I didn't find offended at all. I feel like it's really inspiring and it's beautiful. The second one just want to share. So it's more about I just want to add perhaps colonization curriculum should probably include the leadership, within that. I think that's my suggestion.
It didn't quite grasp your second question, because I wasn't quite sure I understood, but I heard probably who the author of this poem is, the poem that you mentioned.
So what was the author you mentioned for poem?
You think it on camera?
Sorry. Nabokov, sorry.
Oh, Nabokov.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so it's a question
It's my
about
fault.
what should be
Yeah.
included in the curriculum. But let's think about translation first of all. You're absolutely right. It's shocking how little readers in Anglophone countries read works in translation from other languages. 6% is a shocking statistic. I talked in Shanghai a bit about the problem of an idea of world literature that depends on translation, because it's good for writers in minor languages to have their voices heard by readers who only read in the major languages, say English or French or Mandarin, maybe. On the other hand, this does mean that those languages remain the dominant languages. So there's a kind of trade-off there. It would be much better if people in the Anglophone countries bothered to learn other languages. But I suppose if that's not going to happen, then the second best thing is for them to be reading good translations. So it's something we can all hope for. I don't know what the answer is. It's clearly a commercial issue. If publishers find that translations don't sell, they're not going to commission translations. And translators, by and large, don't get the acknowledgement that they deserve, not to mention the financial rewards that they deserve. So I quite agree that it's not a good situation, and part of the process of decolonizing the curriculum ought to be finding ways in which the speakers of the dominant languages in the world can get a sense of what it is to be a Thai speaker or a Swahili speaker or whatever it might be. Yes, should there be any limits on what is read? I think the important question, and it's a bit like the question of is Shakespeare, do we avoid Shakespeare, do we not read Shakespeare because Shakespeare was a sexist, chauvinist, racist, like most of his contemporaries, all of his contemporaries probably, and the answer is no. You go on reading Shakespeare, you go on reading dead white males as well as women and people of colour, but you provide context. You both understand the context from which a writer comes, and you invite and affirm a variety of readings which might oppose or expose or play with or make fun of some of the attitudes that would have been around at the time in which the work was written. So I'm all for more contextualization, more commentary, more the same is true for works in other languages, more variety in approaches and understanding of that each of us has a different personal history, is in a different cultural, ideological, emotional situation, and therefore each literary work will mean something different to us, and that we should build on and value that variety and that richness.
So I wanted to, could you expand a little bit there? Because I know in some of your work, particularly in the singularity of literature, the work of literature, you talk very kind of passionately about the program for reading, the program for criticism as being one of openness to what the text can do to transform us. But do you think there's a kind of necessary risk that these texts could transform us in retrograde or bad ways?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's an inevitable consequence of being open to whatever a literary work brings to you. It's an inevitable consequence that might not be a good thing. We have to be aware that if literature is powerful, it's powerful for bad as well as for good. I mean, you think of historical examples. However, my view would be that the very openness is itself an overriding positive virtue, positive thing, and that we can hopefully rely on other kinds of safeguard, social, educational, institutional, against whatever bad effects literary works might have. Fortunately, I think that's very rare. I think by and large, writers are responsible and what they write has a positive, a potentially positive effect on their readers. But it does remain, I think, just logically necessary if what is valuable about the experience of a literary work, and that experience is an experience of what I call otherness, something one has never experienced before, there's no way of guaranteeing in advance what that will take, where that will take you. Will it take you to a good place or a bad place? But usually I think it's a good place. Thank you.
Is there a question next from Catherine?
Okay, thank you, Professor. I heard during talk that people needs to chamber and not just putting this together.
We can't quite hear you.
You can't hear me?
Yeah, you might want to talk more directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question has to do with the word critique. And of course, that word sounds very German to me, right? It has that legacy, that Kantian legacy. And after Kant, it also had the Frankfurt School. So there's a pretty long legacy of criticism here that I'm also kind of thinking through. I'm not sure what you're thinking of post-critique how that responds to that tradition, doing away with that criticism, that critique is in a sense a bit, I'm a little hesitant because of so much of our theory today, especially those drawing on historical materialism, and especially those drawing on historical materialism, takes off those criticisms as well, and is still using critique for discussing politics and the relationship between politics and aesthetics in non-ideological ways. So I'm kind of wondering what that tradition or what that legacy of critique, how that circulates in your thoughts.
Right, of course, the term, in some ways it's an unfortunate one, although maybe there's another agenda here. Going back to Kant and to Kant's use of the word critique, Kant's idea of critique, is also something that Belsky would be opposing. There is a kind of anti-Kantian movement. Object-oriented ontology would be one example, or the work of Quentin Meillassoux in France, which is turning against the post-Kantian Kantian heritage in mid-20th century thought. That's to say, the emphasis on the textual or linguistic construction of reality, mental construction of reality. So these movements arguing for a kind of priority of the material world over the mental world, so a reversing of the Kantian position. And actually Belsky does tend to go along with that. You know, she favors what she calls the actor network theory of Renaud Latour, where you try to find ways of talking about the material world as if there were agents, as if you know, the chairs and tables in this room were agents themselves. So it's post-critique, if you like, in that sense as well, which would be to take in a much longer history of that word critique. But that's not the main thrust of her argument. It is a narrower focus. I'm not sure why she chose the word critique. She could have, I suppose it's a handy word. If she'd said ideology critique, for instance, which would be a translation of a German phrase, it would be a much narrower, the focus would be clearly much narrower, because Kantian critique is not about ideology critique at all. So I think really you're pointing out the problematics of that word, which may or may not be something she intended. Thank you.
So we've got another question.
Okay. Thank you for your really illuminating talk. I guess I'm not familiar with post-critique at all, so it's learning the term. And what I find fascinating is when you, I guess, make references to the idea of reading as events. And my work engaged with kind of film study background. So I wondered to what extent post-critique takes us to think about reception study. You mentioned ISA and so I wondered to what extent it takes us to look at paratext on different, in the quote you mentioned the different reproductions of Shakespeare text, things like that, and reproductions, but also not just look at the text, but beyond the text, like things like paratext or adaptations and things like that. Also to what extent it takes us to look at audience, because in film we have this turn of cinephilia, which is we're bringing the love back into the cinema. So there is this sense of allowing us to write about our relationship with the text. So I wonder to what extent, particularly your take on post-critique and how it has been used to look at things beyond the formalist aspects and the kind of the interest in that, but more contextual and perhaps audience aspects of it. So so that I could go read more and perhaps grow relationship on this development if there were. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, the question of the love of literature, which would be the equivalent of cinephilia, is certainly one that gets talked about much more now than it would be 20 years ago. There's a very good book on the history of the idea of loving literature, that stops in the 19th century actually. But yeah, I think it's very much in part about being open about readership, or in the case of film, audience responses effectively, emotionally, as well as intellectually. And I see no reason why it shouldn't be as interested in paratext as in the text itself. These are all aspects that readers enjoy. Readers enjoy reading biographies of the writers that they favour, or stories about the directors of films. It is a very, if you don't want to follow the prescriptions of Rita Felsky and those who, like her, follow Bruno Latour, if you want to be more open about it, I think it is a healthy expansion of critical approaches, as long as, and this is going back to something I said earlier, as long as the decolonizing aspect isn't lost sight of, as long as the unignorable, I think, inescapable fact of many works of literature coming from a time and a place in which there was reprehensible racism, sexism, anti-gay feeling, and in many places there still are such feelings. So I think the best of both worlds is what we should aim at.
So I wonder again if I could push you a little bit further, Derek, to address something that I noticed in the talk, that when you were considering curriculum revision development, the examples that were being used were of addressing the canonicity of past texts and not to deal with the cultural baggage that comes along with it. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about how curricula that have courses that deal with contemporary literature might kind of navigate the waters of being decolonial and being open in these ways to the literariness of literature as well.
Yeah, contemporary literature obviously doesn't require, at least on the face of it, doesn't require the same sort of contextualization, since it's our time. Presumably we're talking about contemporary literature in her own language. It's saying Thai literature in Bangkok. But I would argue that all literature, it's very unlikely that you would ever pick up a literary text that wasn't in some ways other. If even in Thai work written last year in Bangkok would still come from a place, what I call an idioculture, the singular cultural nexus which produced that work, the author being an individual, unlike any other individual, a singular individual will be producing a work that you will need to understand as other, as singular, as if it's a good work, as inventive. So I wouldn't say contemporary literature is any different in kind, it's only different in degree from looking at literature of previous centuries. Contemporary literature from a different culture. If I were to read a Thai work in English translation, clearly I would then be dealing with exactly the same issues of otherness and having to be open to different ways of seeing the world and understanding the world. So I think that's my answer. But no, doesn't constitute a significant difference, and we're fooling ourselves if we think, oh, here's a work that was written in 2020. I'm just going to absorb it because it's already been talking to me about my own self. No, it will be a different thing together.
I think we might have time for 2 more questions before we have to wrap up with 1 year.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the very thought-provoking talk. I actually have like 3 related questions. I think related questions. The first one is the idea of literature and emotion. If you say that literature gets to the center of human condition through creating this kind of emotion, and kind of find that there's this interesting tension between the general, the communal feeling of emotion, at the same time the specific, the singularity of each literature to create its reader this kind of emotion. So where actually is the boundary? What is the boundary between the literary and the non-literary? Especially let's say if you read essays or documentary works that gets to emotion too, would that be considered literary works too, or even literary criticisms to draw Jeffrey Hartman, who kind of wants to blur the boundary between literary works and bad criticisms. So how do we actually define what literary works are, or the concept of literariness itself? And so, which leads me to my second question. When you talk about the rhythm, the style, the syntax of the work itself, and when it comes to fundamental elements of each work are thinking in terms of cognition as well, and I would like to hear you talk more about how cognition plays a role in our reading of literary works. Because
what plays a role?
Oh, cognition. Yeah, cognition. Because it's I think it's something as elemental, as fundamental as emotion, because and sometimes even unconscious we read different works, not literary or non-literary works, and we draw on this kind of communal elements of being human beings, our cognitions are shared faculties. So that's, I guess it could shed light on how we view what are literary works and what not. And my final question deals with the current state of literary studies as well. So to go back to my first question, it's usually when we talk about literature or literary studies, we bring in kind of other disciplines to, let's say, at the service of literary studies. And when you talk about the openness on your part about decolonizing the curriculum, what is your thought about the openness when it comes to breaking the boundary between different disciplines? Let's say, can we open up the opportunities to bring in other disciplines, not just as kind of something subservient to the literary studies itself, but something more cooperative, while at the same time retaining the singularity of literary studies? Because I think that has been one of the big questions when it comes to literary studies: what we actually study and what defines literature. How can we separate ourselves from other disciplines, while at the same time keep the open arm? Let's say we want to be cooperative, but at the same time we have to define ourselves precisely what we are doing, so as to find our niche, to find our firm ground in relation to other disciplines. I hope that makes sense.
I'll try and deal with this. The question of literary and non-literary responses. it's true that emotional responses are something we feel for all sorts of writing, right? It's not peculiar to literature. So that's why I was putting forward the argument that what's distinctive about the way literature works as a generator of emotion is that it does that, at least in part, through formal devices. It's not purely, to touch on the second question, it's not purely cognitive. It's not simply that through the language you are being given facts, factual information. You're being taken through an event. You're being allowed to experience an event in which the formal structures of language and narrative and genre are operating in concert with the cognitive, with an emotional and, of course, cognitive effect. So that's what distinguishes, I think, literary writing, which can be, as I was saying, a feature of other discourses. Historical writing is often literary in the sense that it uses metaphor or rhythmic sentences or whatever, and in that way operates partly as literature and partly as simply factual information. But if you take away the question of form, as I think pre-post critique writing often did, then here I'm with Falsky, historical approaches, materialist approaches, ideology critique approaches often wrote and write about the literary work as if it were purely cognitive, as if it were purely a matter of this writer says this about the world, or about humanity, or about this event. The Heart of Darkness would be an example. It's read as if it was simply a statement of the author's beliefs about Africa and race. Whereas if you take into account its formal properties, it becomes something different. It becomes an event rather than a body of information that you can take away and do something with. You can only experience it. If you want it again, you have to read it again. You can't say, oh, now I've got what I need from it, and I can put the book away now. Literature depends on rereading and rereading. So maybe that takes us into your second question about cognitive approaches. But cognition clearly is central to all reading. But in literature, it's presented as an event in a formal way. And what that means is that in a way it's kind of staged. It's a performance of the world. It's not a direct way of accessing the world. It's the world as performed by a formal event. As for other disciplines, yes, I think that just happens. We read partly as geographers, partly as historians, partly as aestheticians, as philosophers, as music lovers. Maybe I didn't quite get the drift of your question, but I suppose you're saying, could other disciplines enter not as subservient, you said, but as equal partners in the relationship? And yes, perhaps that's the case. I'm not sure if you had any examples in mind, which particular disciplines you thought of, but I'm perfectly happy with the idea that literary criticism is a porous discipline. It's a discipline which has no clear boundaries. That it's constantly moving in and out of other areas, a kind of chameleon, really. Yeah, I think that's all I can say.
Okay. So unless there's one final question, that might be a good place to round off. Okay, so there's one to go ahead. No? Okay, so
There was one there.
Oh, there was one? Yes. Sorry.
Since we as youth, we are exposed to that kind of literature, like Shakespeare, and as human, we humans tend to be influenced by something, and we feel like alienated by the subject of other literature. So I would like to ask you, how, in your way, how can you be exposed to a more bigger variety of literature? Thank you.
It's up to you, isn't it? I think certainly the wider variety of literature that you can be exposed to, the better. So that we were talking about works of literature might not necessarily have a good effect, but the more you read and the more widely you read, the more any potential negative responses, negative effects can be counterbalanced by positive effects. So obviously there are economic and institutional reasons why certain texts are foregrounded and others might be harder to access. But I think it's important, as far as possible, to hear as many voices as possible. And not just the voices of those who think like us, voices of those who think differently, who feel differently, who have different experiences to relay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Derek, and thank you everybody for stimulating questions and discussion and helping us to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the faculty as well. So wish you safe travels home and hope you'll join me once again in thanking Derek.
Thank you for listening so carefully and for your questions.